Scattered attacks had intensified during the last hours of April 30th, 1968 at the Dongha sector. The Marines, fierce as ever, were all in for some combat, but something was off. These skirmishes seemed coordinated. By the time the Marines made one of the prisoners speak about the nature of the attacks, it was already too late to call reinforcements. The sector was being invaded by more than 10,000 NVA troops coming from all directions, and there were only 600 Marines to stop them. It was now up to the outnumbered Leathernecks to fend off a massive assault from taking over the sector. Even so, many Devil Dogs were optimistic. The odds were not even. Not for the NVA. Dongha. After the conflict stabilized and the North Vietnamese vanished in 1967, the flames of war were quickly ignited again with the launch of the surprise Tet Offensive on January 30th, 1968. Reinvigorated by Chinese and Soviet military support, the PAVN advanced swiftly through the south. More than 80,000 North Vietnamese poured into over 100 cities and towns under American control, including the cities of Hue and Saigon. The Vietnam War had reached a new height. The counterattack was quick and effective, despite taking the U.S. forces off guard. The Marines and the Army held the line, and Saigon and Hue turned into a combat zone where more than 6,000 civilians perished. By February 25th, both cities were under U.S. control at the cost of 120 Americans and 370 friendly ARVN troops. Enemy casualties exceeded 7,000. Nevertheless, the fight was not over yet. The Marines at Khasan would fight the enemy for 77 days. By April, NVA casualties had reached a staggering 45,000, with more than 6,000 taken as prisoners of war. Broken, but not yet defeated, the NVA retreated to the north, leaving behind a trail of fire. Army and USMC fire bases were attacked, and the entire zone was contested by both forces. The NVA knew that most of the U.S. war effort was focused around Khasan and the A Shau Valley, and decided to lead a new offensive on the eastern side of the DMZ. The plan was simple. If the NVA took control of Quang Tri Province, the entire east coast would fall under its control, including Dongha and the Qua Viet and Bois Dieu rivers. If that happened, the entire American supply network would collapse, as Dongha was the command post of the 3rd Marine Division, the 9th Marines, and the main logistic base for the northern region. Despite its critical importance, Dongha was vulnerable and lacked reinforcements. As such, the NVA increased their attacks in the area during the last week of April. Dai Do. On April 29th, Marine Task Force Ravi ran into an NVA ambush at Cam Vu Route 88. The engagement began at 4 p.m. and lasted over 7 hours until midnight. The task force suffered 11 casualties and 22 wounded, while the enemy lost over 26 men and managed to inflict severe damage to some of the tanks the Marines were using. The entire sector was put on high alert, and Dongha was reinforced with additional Marines from the area. Then, at 4 a.m. the following day, the NVA ambushed Navy landing craft carrying supplies bound for Dongha. Major General Rathvan McClure, commander of the 3rd Marine Division, ordered a battalion of Marines to investigate. The 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, was dispatched to the same location to cleanse it of NVA presence, and a violent firefight broke out. The Vietnamese retreated under cover of artillery and mortar fire, but lost over 40 soldiers. Over 70 Leathernecks were wounded and 20 perished. While the men of the 9th recovered, another encounter erupted some 2,500 meters north of Dongha in the village of Dai Do. This time, the 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, faced the powerful 320th NVA Division. Ambushes. At least 4 NVA battalions had made their way into friendly territory without being noticed, and immediately entrenched themselves with well-defended bunkers. The enemy soon went on the offensive and began pinning down Marine units in the area. Companies F and H, with the assistance of 2 M48 Patton tanks and Amtraks, then launched an attack on Dai Do at around 2 p.m. However, mortar and recoilless rifle fire destroyed one of the Amtraks, and the Marines' advance was halted by accurate NVA machine gun fire. Even so, the Devil Dogs were able to capture Dongchuan. Another Marine task force was sent aboard Navy patrol boats to secure a landing zone near Lam Juan, but encountered heavy enemy resistance. The Marines lost another Amtrak, and Company B was pinned down trying to secure An Loc. Although the 600 Marines in the region did not know it yet, they were simultaneously fighting over 10,000 NVA forces. However, the enemy didn't know they were fighting a drastically inferior force either. The Devil Dogs were unable to secure Daido when it was overwhelmed by the enemy during the night, but Lieutenant Commander William Weiss, the battalion commander of the 2-4 Marines, ordered Gulf Company to attack Daido at 10:40 a.m. on May 1st, after 2 hours of intense shelling and bombing. Gulf Company Commander Captain J.R. Vargas then proceeded to clear out the NVA bunkers. The valiant captain was wounded a second time during the attack, but kept fighting and assumed a defensive position after falling back. Meanwhile, Echo Company, under the command of Captain James E. Livingston, was on the move towards An Loc. Overwhelming odds. Once at the town, Livingston gathered the remnants of another Marine unit and interrogated a dozen prisoners of war. The Marines then learned they were facing more than 12 NVA companies. At 3 a.m. on May 2nd, Livingston received orders to prepare Echo Company for a close-quarters attack on Daido. They then fixed their bayonets and charged with their M16s straight into the enemy. Echo linked up with Gulf Company and Captain Vargas along the way, and both companies split up and attacked from different flanks. While Livingston stormed the enemy trenches, Vargas and his men were greeted by RPK machine gun fire from NVA bunkers. Hand-to-hand combat followed inside the enemy positions, but while cleaning the enemy bunkers, Livingston was wounded by shrapnel. Even so, he continued leading his men, and Vargas and Gulf then joined Echo to form a defensive perimeter. When the hardened Marines were about to take a deep breath from the intense charge, Hotel Company showed up in a nearby stream. However, it was immediately pinned down by concealed Vietnamese forces. Gulf and Echo tried to support their comrades, but Livingston was hit by machine gun fire as the Marines rushed to the enemy. His leg was almost torn apart. The seasoned captain ordered his men to withdraw and held his ground until all his Marines were safe. Only then did he allow his troops to evacuate him to the defensive perimeter. Once more into the fray. As night covered the horizon, the able-bodied Marines from the scattered companies gathered and stood vigilant for another NVA attack. The Americans were resupplied by Navy boats and enjoyed food and rest before the NVA began sending more scout troops. The Vietnamese launched the main assault, but were decimated by the M60 machine guns from the Marines and their artillery support. Gulf and Foxtrot companies then charged the retreating enemy. While doing so, Captain Vargas and his men were pinned down by enemy reinforcements and were forced to stay prone in rice paddies near Tuang Do. Bullets were flying over their heads, and Vargas ordered his men to crawl inside the perimeter to stay together. He then called in artillery and naval fire to support Gulf. Vargas was then hit a fourth time while issuing orders, but managed to impose order and began retreating. Following this last attack, the rest of the NVA 320th Division withdrew from the area, believing the Marines were equal in numbers. By May 3rd, Daido had been completely secured once again. The Marines had lost over 80 men, with some 400 wounded out of the 600-strong garrison during the 3-day battle. In contrast, the NVA reported about 2,500 casualties out of the 10,000 that took part in the attacks. Captains Vargas and Livingston were awarded the Medal of Honor for their exemplary leadership in combat, and most of the 2-4 Marines were awarded the Purple Heart. Presidential Unit Citation. Despite the incredible odds, the battle was buried by the media outlets at the time. Only a small percentage of Americans knew what happened to the 600 Marines. The blackout was not intentional. Marine survivors have pointed out that the battle coincided with the riots and political unrest that took hold of the United States following the assassination of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Nevertheless, half a century after the legendary Battle of Daido, Montana Senator John Tester is looking to recognize the valor of the Marines that fought the forgotten Battle of Daido, trying to get President Joe Biden to give the Marines a Presidential Unit Citation. Regardless, some journalists and military historians believe it will never happen. Based on documents from the Department of Defense, There's no record of an instance in which a presidential citation has been awarded to a unit half a century later. As of May 2022, the White House has not communicated anything related to this one-of-a-kind petition, which would be a humble homage to the devil dogs that perished while holding the line against the waves of hostile North Vietnamese soldiers. Thank you for watching our video. Please like and subscribe to our Dark Documentaries channels to find more exciting historical content about the wars that defined the 20th century. And don't forget to hit the bell icon to be notified of our newest videos. Stay tuned.